now. So ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We have a very interesting agenda. Thank you, Angela, for the comment. We have a very short but interesting agenda today with us. We are going to be speaking about nature on the board and essentially what directors need to know. As we start off, just very quick housekeeping aspects. We have a Q&A button. Please, if you have any question, please put it on the Q&A button on your screen. We also have the chat button if you have, and if you're willing to kindly introduce yourselves on the chat. It's important for us to know each other, to know the team that is in the call today. We are quite a number of us, so we may not be able to interact as intimately as we'd like to, but happy for you to put your organizations on the chat. And today we are going to speak about nature on the board. And this morning we are going to ask a very interesting team to come and speak to us today. My name is Dorothy Maseke. I lead the nature program at FSD Africa, and I also lead the secretariat at the African Natural Capital Alliance. The webinar today is on this paper, which we have co-published between ANCA /FSD Africa and the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, CCLI. I'm going to very quickly walk you through the agenda. And what we will have is, we'll have at some point Victoria immediately after I stop speaking. Today is Victoria's Day, a very key author for this particular paper. She's currently the Nature Governance Advisor at FSD Africa. And she's going to set the scene on the international legal landscape. She's also going to cover the paper's core findings. At the heart of this session is a 30-minute panel, jurisdictional panel that will cover Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria with some of the top practicing lawyers from each market, which Victoria is going to moderate. And then we are going to spare some time for some Q&A, and then I will close with what to do next. Moving on. Just very quickly, today is not about what we do at the nature program, but important for you to kind of know why we do what we do. And what we just need to understand is nature negative finance flows are estimated at around 7 trillion a year. And this essentially outweigh positive flows by roughly 35 to 1. Yet at the same time, positive nature finance sits at only around 200 billion a year against a need of around 950 billion by 2030. So the nature program within FSD Africa works on both sides of the ledger, curbing negative finance flows and scaling nature positive ones. And this is across the 3 impact areas of conservation areas, cities, and productive landscapes. Today's paper specifically speaks directly to both reducing nature negative financing flows, but also increasing nature positive financing. And what we are going to cover today essentially is the director duties as being one of the levers that can inform how that capital essentially is directed. Our work cuts across these 4 pillars that you can see: policy, capacity building, data and metrics, and a big piece which is on ecosystem orchestration. And what essentially we do, we work with the regulators, we work with central banks to essentially bring forward a supporting enabling environment. We also have a big piece on capacity building, and this is where our TNFD work comes in. I've seen Candice Dot joining. Candice is a director at TNFD. And what we have been doing is supporting financial institutions with piloting the TNFD. And so the director roles, director duties still comes in very critically when it comes to understanding of nature-related risks, opportunities, impacts, and dependencies. An interesting piece of work is our investments pipeline or investments catalyzation. And this is where we work with pipelines through our accelerators. We are working on blended finance mechanisms. We are de-risking investments. And this is also where our core investment sits in. And so over the past few years, we've been able to carry out some core nature-related investments, which we can speak about at some point. And just one last thing, even as we proceed, is about the African Natural Capital Alliance, 150 institutions covering 45 countries with total net assets of actually greater than 1 trillion. And papers like this, Director's Duty paper, are not just an academic exercise. The evidence in this paper comes from ANCA membership organizations. I think you will see in the paper we have one of our governing council members speaking about why this is important. On the call, I know we also have a few governing council members joining us. We also have quite a number of ANCA members and even non-members who have been working with us. And so if you're interested to learn more about ANCA, please join us. There's a link. Sinalo, my colleague, will be putting a link on the chat on how you can participate. But also we want to give a shout out to our TNFD pilot members who have really played a key role in the nature financing environment. And we're actually now seeing them drive forward transactions. The next slide just shows you our governing council members: Nedbank, Equity Bank, All Mutual, Landscapes Alliance, IPBES, that's science is also important. Everything that we do is rooted on data, rooted on science, and then African Wildlife Foundation. And we're incredibly fortunate to have these governing council members who essentially are supporting us on the greater strategic direction that ANCA is taking. As I finish, because this is, we need to dive deep into what is most important. Why now? Why now? And the reasons for this paper is disclosure is arising, and ISSB standards are being adopted across African markets. Nature-related risk is entering mainstream financial reporting. Whether we like it or not, it's coming at some point. Secondly, the risks are real and current. And with the African institutions we have been working with, they are actually navigating live nature and climate shocks, not hypothetical ones. And so essentially the continent is currently planning, we need to currently plan for what is coming, not just now, but also what is happening, not just now, but also in the future. And thirdly, capital must flow. And capital must flow, but through this independent legal analysis, it shows why capital allocation must essentially reflect the world that we live in today. And ANCA is a natural home for this work, and so we were very glad to partner with CCLI on this particular paper. And just in terms of going forward, we will be working very closely with Chapter 0, and we will be working with Chapter 0 to actually engage hundreds of directors. It is our hope to discuss the implications of the findings of this paper to their business. And so please do reach out if you want to be involved with this program. I also want to give a shout out to Caroline Rabar, who is the lead of Chapter 0 Alliance, the Kenya chapter, who can put her contacts on the chat. Essentially, an entity that is dealing and working with directors on nature and on climate. And so there's no better partner for us than Chapter 0 Alliance. And so I just want to stop there and hand over to Victoria. Victoria, please come to the stage and really take us through what this is going to be about. Welcome, Victoria.
So much, Dorothy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining for today's webinar. I'm really excited to be able to present the findings of this paper that was published just last week to everyone here today. And so I think the first thing really to say is that this Africa paper does not stand alone. It sits within an international body of work and also legal opinions that explore directors' duties in the context of climate risk, but also nature risk. And the generally recognized starting point for a lot of this work was around 2016 with the Hartley opinion on climate-related risks and directors' duties in Australia. And that opinion concluded that directors who failed to consider foreseeable climate-related risks could be found personally liable for breaching their duty of care and diligence under the Australian Corporations Act. So since then, and it's only really 10 years ago now, so since then there have been numerous legal opinions on climate-related risks. And in 2023, we saw the first landmark opinion that was extended to nature-related risks. Globally, we now have 5 legal opinions on directors' duties and nature-related risks in New Zealand and Australia, England and Wales, Canada, and the Philippines. And the Africa paper published last week is the first comprehensive analysis on this continent that explores nature-related risks, specifically in the context of Kenyan law, South African law, and Nigerian law, based on each country's own statutes and case laws. So it's not a foreign imported reasoning, but it's much rather grounded and rooted. And I'm so delighted to have some of the local lawyers representing on the panel today. Next slide, please, Sonalo. So what were the paper's core findings? So we've got 4 core findings on this slide. 3 are risk-focused, and then 1 is also opportunity-focused. So the first is that, the first thing the paper found is that financial governance, this is a financial governance matter. So the paper's central conclusion was that directors of companies in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya already have an existing legal obligation under existing company law frameworks to identify and manage nature-related risks. So it's not an aspiration or an emerging best practice. It flows from the duties that directors already owe to their companies, being very broadly the duty to act in the best interest of the company and the duty of care, skill, and diligence. And so where nature-related risks are foreseeable and financially material to a company, whether that's through their dependencies, for example, on water, on soil, on pollination, or through their impacts, that creates a regulatory and reputational exposure, attending to them is part of the core duty of a director. So second, and following directly on from that, these existing duties are sufficient to encompass nature-related risks. So this paper does not advocate for new legislation in any way. It's an analysis of existing law. And this matters because it changes the conversation in the boardroom from sort of we'll wait for the regulator to move to the obligation that is already there, and the question on how directors can discharge their duties in today's world, which is incredibly volatile and uncertain and very complex. The third finding is that the direction of travel is fairly clear on 2 converging fronts. So firstly, on the litigation side, so we continue to see climate-related cases being brought across the world, including cases in South Africa and Nigeria that are highlighted in the paper. And then there was 1 case also filed recently in Zambia against the Attorney General. And in the Zambian case, for example, the issue centers around whether the state's failure to establish and implement climate governance mechanisms under the Green Economy and Climate Change Act constitute a violation of its constitutional duty. And these obviously climate-related cases. There is an expectation that nature-related litigation will follow, and in many ways it's actually easier to bring than climate-related litigation. And then secondly, on this disclosure side, we're seeing an evolving nature-related disclosure landscape that we'll pick up on in the panel discussion as well. And fourth, and not to make this such a risk-heavy conversation, there is also obviously an enormous nature-related opportunity on this continent. And this is really a very cool message that we don't want to lose. So the same analysis that exposes these risks also realizes the advantage of investing in nature-related projects on the continent. And of course, Africa is very rich in natural capital. And we'll spotlight one of the examples that was presented in the paper during the panel discussion as well. Next slide, please, Sonalo. So I'm just going to touch very, very briefly on these 3 jurisdictions because I much prefer the panelists to deep dive on the findings that are in the paper. But very broadly, the paper looks at Kenya, South Africa, and Nigerian company law frameworks and finds that the Companies Act 2015 in Kenya provides that directors have a duty of care, skill, and diligence, and a duty to promote the success of the company. And the finding is that these duties encompass identifying and managing nature-related risk whenever it is foreseeable and material. So no new law needed. And at the same time, Kenya is also a really ambitious disclosure adopter and is committed to mandatory IFRS S1 and S2 for public interest entities from next year. South Africa has one of the most mature governance cultures on the continent, if not the most mature governance culture on the continent that we will explore later, particularly in the context of integrated reporting in King 5. And then Nigeria, under the 2020, the Nigerian president signed the Companies and Allied Matters Act into law, which really marked a very significant reform in Nigeria's corporate law landscape, modernizing corporate governance and having significant implications on how companies manage sustainability-related issues. Next slide, please, Sonalo. And also in this context, I just want to touch very briefly on this rule that may be familiar to some of you, known as the business judgment rule. What the business judgment rule does is it does many things, but one of the things that I think is really interesting in the context of this conversation is that it allows directors to make informed good faith decisions. So without being heavily scrutinized as to how, why it made those decisions. So in this context, we're starting to see the protection under the business judgment rule, shifting the questions in boardrooms from, can we justify investing in nature? What is the business case for investing in nature? To, can we justify not investing in nature? And have we documented why we haven't invested in nature or why we haven't managed the nature-related risks that are material to the business? And then some of the opportunities that come alongside sort of the thinking around, boards starting to integrate nature into strategic decision-making and risk management. Some of those opportunities associated with that are listed on the right-hand side. And we will share these slides after the call and also the webinar recording. With that, Sonalo, next slide, please. I'm so delighted to introduce this wonderful panel to you that I will be moderating for the next 30 minutes or so. We have Jess Blumenthal from ENS in South Africa. Jess is an executive with ENS focusing on banking and finance. We have Sami Ndolo, managing partner of CDH Kenya. Muriuki Muriungi, co-founder and partner of KMK Africa. And Enabong Shitu, legal director of DLA Piper Africa, based in Nigeria. I'm really delighted to introduce all the panelists to you today. And with that, can I ask you, please, yes, to put your videos on and unmute yourself, and we will kick off with the panel discussion. At the same time, please do drop any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we can pick up on those towards the end of the panel discussion. We really do want to spare 10 minutes of time for a bit of an interactive discussion after the panelists have explored their questions. So please do keep the questions coming. We're very, very keen to hear your thoughts and your feedback. So I wanted to start off in Kenya, and Sami, Muriuki, I hope you don't mind us starting here, but perhaps firstly to you, Sami. So the paper concludes that directors' duties under the Kenyan Companies Act already encompass nature-related risks, where they are foreseeable and material. And I just wondered, in your experience of advising Kenyan boards and across your client base, how much awareness do you feel that there is of this exposure, and does this legal analysis in this paper change the conversation at all?
Yeah, absolutely, Victoria. Happy for us to start off. I hope I'm clear and audible.
Perfect.
All right. Yeah, so good afternoon, good day, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. I think the short answer, Victoria, is that awareness remains uneven, and I think it's a sort of a mixed bag. I think advising boards in Kenya and directors, you get the feeling that they understand environment in a more narrow compliance sort of approach, where they look at EIA licenses, environmental impact assessment licensing, or NEMA requirements. So those are the environmental requirements that the regulator may have. But few have really internalized the requirement for the need to promote the success of the company in relation to the obligations of directors and the duties of directors under the Companies Act. Because when they are supposed to act and promote the success of the company, that includes understanding and evaluating the impact of the operations of that business to the community as well as the environment. And when you look at how the environment is defined in our environmental legislation, it's quite wide and includes biodiversity, ecosystems. And so nature-related risks fall squarely within this scope. But you get the sense that many directors don't really appreciate how wide those obligations might be. Our constitution also has requirements for everyone to have a right to a healthy environment, and they impose obligations on on entities to make sure that that is also fulfilled. So I think this report really changes the conversation in two ways, I would say. The first one is that it identifies that the framework is there, and therefore it removes this optional ESG framing that directors may have. That is a peripheral issue. It's not central to how we do our business, and that voluntary, compliance is best practice. But I think this report really shows that directors have to take these things seriously and evaluate them as they undertake their business operations. I think also we identified in the report that there's a willingness, and the judiciary has expressed signaling that there's a willingness to scrutinize how EIA licenses, for example, are obtained. So the judiciary is willing to look back and assess whether there's genuine care that was taken in assessing the impact of some of these things that companies are engaged in, whether there's sufficient environmental due diligence. And so the standards that directors must ensure they comply with, you find the window is closing between environmental liability and director responsibility. That window is narrowing. And I think this report really brings that to the fore.
Thanks so much, Sammy. And I really also want to pick up on this point that you raised around, directors' duties are quite wide. It's not just the environment that exists within the Companies Act that they have a duty towards. There are, also within the same sentence, it says environment and community. And I'll come back to that, I think perhaps with you, Jess, around like managing these multiple it's multiple risks, but also opportunities, and how community, environment, profit all interact with each other, and what are some practical tips that we can think about to support boards to manage some of these quite challenging questions. But first, Marieke, I just wanted to see ask what you're seeing as well, because you're also in Kenya. Are you seeing similar sort of unevenness of understanding around what it means to act in the best interest of the company today, particularly as the operating context and external context funding environment is really changing quite rapidly? What are you seeing in across your clients?
Yes, thanks, Victoria, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, I'll echo what Sammy mentioned, and it is indeed true. We are seeing some bit of divergence in terms of the understanding across companies, directors on what is required of them. Of course, some, like those who are maybe operating in some particular sectors, having a much better realization or appreciation of what it entails relative to other sectors. But broadly speaking, I do not think we are at a level of what is required under the law, just as the report highlights. Because if you begin to unpack those duties of directors and what they entail, the duty to promote the success of the company, the duty to take to work with care, skill, and diligence that is required, the duty to even do financial statements, which is a duty of a director, and if you link that to the very fact that these nature risks actually do affect the balance sheets of the companies, whether they invested in the sector or they're lending to the sector, whether in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And the duty to promote, because the duty to ensure the success of the company really means that you need to deal in such a way that both in the short term, in the medium term, and the long term, the company succeeds. And of course, there's also a duty currently now in law to foster relationships among various stakeholders. So there's been sort of a shift even from what traditionally used to be under company law, that we should just focus on the shareholder only. And that is even assuming that attending to the nature-related concerns is not beneficial to the shareholder, but it is in fact beneficial if you think about how dependent, especially African economies and various sectors, are on nature. And so it might even be financially beneficial to shareholders to deal with nature risks. But even if it were not, it is still a legal obligation in terms of the way the law has shifted, because the Companies Act in Kenya, for instance, is now about 11 years old. It was enacted in 2015. And so it was sort of a subtle shift in terms of the framework or the legal regime on the Companies Act. And so that's what I would say. If you actually go onto each of the directors' duties and consider it one by one, you actually see that there's something that is embedded there. And back to the point that you began, it says duty to consider the operations or the impact of the company on the community and the environment. And so it is a legal obligation. Like some say, it's no longer optional. It's no longer a corporate social responsibility or simply an ethical thing, but also a legal obligation at the moment, which then means that directors need to begin to integrate the same into their risk registers, into their practices as a company, so that then they not only so that they prevent from falling afoul of the legislation, but also it may actually be in the best interest of the company, even in a substantial sense. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sammy. Yeah, and I think as we see, I mean, even as we someone the other day about the impacts of something like extreme weather patterns like the Super El Nino that we're meant to be seeing later this year, and the impacts of that on infrastructure across the continent, and how that impacts bottom lines. Yeah, we're already seeing a lot of these scenarios play out. But Jess, if I can come to you now on this, because I'm always love talking to you about this sort of interrelationship between profit, people, and planet, and how boards manage that in accordance with their duties. And as we're seeing nature risk increase with biodiversity loss, particularly on this continent, but also in many other places, does that risk also increase for companies? And if so, there's a huge amount of focus on community and people and its interactions with nature. What are you seeing in that sort of context in terms of the interdependence and the relationship between these sort of this triple bottom line?
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for having me on the panel. Perhaps before answering that question, just to pick up on something that Morioki said. I mean, I agree. I think in South Africa as well, the response of directors and the ability for directors to take these various different factors into account in decision making is quite sector dependent. And in South Africa as well, we have sectors where directors and boards are quite sophisticated already in their decision making and in undertaking this balancing act that you're talking about. And then there are sectors where perhaps because of the nature of the sector, they haven't yet been called upon to do so, or at least the risk and the dependency is not so obvious to them. And I think that leads to a very varied response depending on who you're engaging with and which board you're having the discussion with. But certainly from the work, my practice and the work that I've done, certainly from a South African perspective, a board making a decision is always required to weigh the impact that a particular